it was only important to the people in the process of nation building, of like, we're doing this. Once it was done, the children that grew up speaking Hebrew as their native language, they didn't need to prove anything.
Shalom and welcome to Hebrew Voices. I'm here today with Elon Gilad. He's a writer for Haaretz, one of the major newspapers in Israel, specializing in Hebrew and Jewish history, and he's the author of a book called The Secret History of Judaism. His research focuses on the interface between biblical and modern Hebrew, with a particular interest in uncovering the origins of traditions and words. Elon shares his linguistic insights through popular TikTok videos on Hebrew etymology. He has a BA from Tel Aviv University and currently is working on a master's there. Shalom, Elon.
Hello.
Hey, so I saw some of your TikTok videos, and it's really interesting. I remember a few years ago when I first got on TikTok, and people were like, what are you doing on TikTok? That's just teenagers dancing. And already at the time, it wasn't. There were already like deep theological discussions there. But now it's actually when the war started last October, it's where I was getting my news. I was watching, the Israeli news live streaming on TikTok. So tell us about. So it's really interesting. You're doing these deep linguistic etymological discussions on TikTok. Let's start. What is etymology? Not to be confused with entomology.
Yeah. So unlike entomology, which is the study of bugs, etymology is the study of word origins. In other words, why we call certain things the way we call them. And while it's a field that doesn't have much practical use and isn't big in academia, it's not something that you can really do a doctorate in. It's really a fun field because every word has its own story. And sometimes those stories are interesting, entertaining. You can learn about societies, about particular moments in history. And I fell in love with this subject, I don't know, maybe close to 12 years ago. And I just started writing a weekly column for Haaretz, and I've been writing about one particular Hebrew word, where it came from, every week. It appears in the Weekend magazine, and it's been more than 10 years, so I've written hundreds of these. And it's a good way to get around history and language.
Yeah. Well, I would disagree that you couldn't do a doctorate in it. There's the famous story of Gershom Scholem, who founded the field of Kabbalah as a scientific study. And he was criticized by the Talmudic scholars, particularly Shaul Lieberman, who said, "You're studying shtut, or shtuyot, nonsense." And he said, "Shtuyot ze shtuyot, aber cheker ha-shtuyot ze mada." Nonsense is nonsense, but the scientific study of nonsense is science. And here it's actually not nonsense, right? In other words, so for me, this is a really important topic because language changes over time. And if you don't realize that, you'll read an ancient text, which is what I do, and you won't understand it. You'll understand it in your own terms rather than in the terms it was originally written in. A famous example from, it shows my age, from my youth was there was a president of the United States who was being charged with high crimes and misdemeanors. And there was a national discussion in the United States. What is a misdemeanor? Because a misdemeanor in modern English, in 21st century English, or even then late 20th century English, is something that's not a felony, right? It's a minor crime.
Small,
right. But when they talked about it in the Constitution or whatever that was, the high crimes and misdemeanors was like treason. It was a big deal. So language changing over time could be really important and could be very practical, right? It could be, do you impeach a president for some trivial thing, or do you impeach him for a very big deal, right? For treason or something, right? So it actually could have a very practical, maybe more practical than half the things I do, right? Which is studying ancient texts. So I would disagree with that. But what is the most interesting word that you've come across? One that's appropriate for, let's say, a young audience, because I've heard some of yours that are, there's some, as we say, piquante things in modern Hebrew, some, spicy things, but yeah.
Well, there's all kinds of interesting stories, and Hebrew gives us nice ones. But I think my all-time favorite, not word, but journey a word went through very far is the word for popsicle in Hebrew, artik.
Okay. Oh, I love that one.
Because yeah, I wrote about this one years ago. And it's just surprising because the word, if you trace it all the way back in history, you'll find that it comes from a word that means frightening in Proto-Indo-European, which is a reconstructed language. In other words, it's a language spoken by people who we didn't write, so we don't have any record of the actual language, but we know this language existed because a lot of languages spoken today in ancient language descended from it, and we can, or not me, but experts in the field can reconstruct this language. And when they go back, they can reconstruct this ancient word, which sounded maybe something like hatikos. We don't really know exactly.
Well, let's back up. So the modern Hebrew word for popsicle isn't popsikul. What is it? So for those who don't know,
it's artik. We call it an artik.
Which sounds awfully like the word Arctic, like Arctic Ocean, and it's not a coincidence.
Well, that's right. So if we could trace it, there's two ways to tell the story. We can tell it from most recent and backwards, but it's more fun if you tell it forward in this case.
Okay.
So these ancient people living on the steppes of Asia, I think the Caucasus, something like that. So they were afraid, and they had this word that they used to describe being afraid. And then what were they afraid of? Bears. And so they used this word for their word for bear. And this word for bear, it went in all kinds of languages. It became the word in Sanskrit and in modern Indian languages and in Persian, etc. And in English, it didn't. That word disappeared. We replaced it with a word related to brown, but that's a different story. But this word made its way into Greek as autikos, which was the Greek word for bear. Now, because there's the Big Dipper, which is the Big Bear, or Ursa Major, the constellation in the sky that points to the northern star. So they started using that word to also refer to northern things. So one of the Greek words for northern was Alticus, which made its way into Latin, also Alticus, or something about that. And from that, Latin slowly devolved into French. And from that's where we get the word Arctic, which came from French. So the people who flash forward to the 1950, a group of Jewish Belgian investors decide they're going to invest in the new state of Israel, and they build the first factory to manufacture, mass-produce popsicles. And they look for a name, and they think, cold, northern, so they call it Arctic. But Arctic doesn't really work in Hebrew. Hebrew has a hard time with a lot of consonants together. So instead of Arctic, and that's what they called the popsicles. So this is an example of what they call a generic word, a generic term that becomes the word. For example, use Xerox thing. Xerox is the name of a company, but Xerox became generic.
So let's say Kleenex, right? Kleenex was originally a brand.
We call Kleenex. That's the name of a brand, but it became the word for the thing. So the same thing happened in Hebrew with the word for Arctic. It's not exactly true. I didn't discuss this on the TikTok, but the next year after this factory called Arctic was founded, and somebody else founded a competitor, and they called themselves Kartiv. And a year after that, those two companies merged. They bought each other, and they became Arctic Kartiv.
Wow.
And a few years after that, there was an investigation. It turns out that these people were stealing money, hiding money from the tax people, and they were arrested and imprisoned, and the company eventually disappeared. But even after this company didn't exist, people still call popsicles Arctic, and they also call them Kartiv. Some people use Kartiv, and some people will use Arctic. And there's a distinction. It's not universal. In other words, I don't distinguish between an Arctic and a Kartiv, but some people do. And they'll use the Arctic for a dairy popsicle and a Kartiv for one that doesn't have any dairy, that it's like a water-based. Yeah.
So it starts out as the name of the company that makes popsicles, and now it's a generic word either for popsicles or a specific type. And it comes from this ancient word for bear or frightening one. Now that's interesting. So now this opens up a bunch of different channels that we can maybe run down. So one of the, and I'm not sure where I want to go with this, but you had a video on TikTok, and I'm sure a column, I would imagine, that was behind it, where you talk about the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. And you're saying in the Greek, one of the words for north was this word for bear because they saw a bear in the sky. So talk to us about the Hebrew words for the directions, because those are fascinating.
So when we say a Hebrew word, there really isn't one Hebrew, right? There's the same way in English, there's Old English, Middle English, and Modern English. So the same thing happens in Hebrew. So we have, in this case, we'll just talk about Biblical Hebrew, and then we'll talk about Modern Hebrew. And now they're related. In other words, a lot of times words in modern Hebrew will come from the Bible. So that's sort of the default. But in the Bible, we don't have one system. In modern Hebrew, it's Safon, Dorom, Mizrach, Marav. That's it. We don't have other words.
So say that a little bit slower for the audience.
Yeah, Safon, north, Dorom, south, Mizrach, east, and Marav, west. And all those words appear in the Bible. In other words, those appear in the Bible, but there's a lot of other words that appear in the Bible too, and they're used interchangeably. There's good questions about asking. So what, the people walking around in, I don't know, King David's time, did they use this word or that word? It must have been confusing if different people used different terms. And the truth is we don't know how this exactly worked. There seems to be different systems for referring, and those could be from different periods, because we know the biblical texts were written in different periods, or it could be geographical differences. But whatever it is, the systems they use are very interesting. And you can also see them, different other cultures use the same systems. So one of the systems follows the movement of the sun. Okay, so you refer to where the sun comes up, and that's why we get Mizrach from. The east is where the Shemesh Zorachat, where the sun rises. So it's Mizrach.
So Mizrach is literally the place of the rising.
The place of the rising. It's the rising. Okay, so it's the rising of the sun. And then Ma'arav is also, it's really the coming or the going away. They imagine the sun goes in when it sets. Because they had an idea of the sun going away into like a tent. You can see it in some poetic verses.
In the Tanakh, we have like the sun comes out like a what is it? A groom coming out of his chuppah, right?
Yeah.
So there's this imaginary sort of room where it goes. Yeah.
Like there's a tent to say the sun goes to sleep and it comes up over there, which is nice. Yeah. And then there's so that's one system that follows the movement of the sun. Then there's another system, which is imagine the person standing and facing the east. Okay, so you're standing east, and then your right, the south. So that's yamin. Yamin is this right, your right hand. So you say south, yamin or teiman. And those mean right. And then north is left, small. And west is chora. For example, the Mediterranean is called the Yam HaChori. So it's the west.
Behind you.
So yeah, that's behind you because you're facing the east, which is kadima, kedma. So
straight ahead.
Straight ahead, exactly. Right. So
why did they do that? Or what's your explanation of why they did that?
Well, it's the truth is we can know. We can try to guess. It's arbitrary. They could have oriented themselves in any direction. The word orient, by the way, that's also itself, right? It's to find your way towards the east.
Right.
So we have that also in English. We use the same idea. One possibility, just off the top of my head, is that that's where civilization was, the great nations where culture was. Because at the time, Judah, Israel, those are quite backwater regions of the world where backward people live. And the great civilizations of Mesopotamia were in the east. So that might be the reason. I don't know. You don't think of
the explanation I've heard, and like,
Yeah.
like you said, we don't know, is that there were people who were traveling along the international caravan routes from Yemen to Damascus, right? You take a boat from India with your spices to Yemen, and you offload somewhere in, I don't know what the port was back then, and then you go by land because of all the pirates, I don't know, and then you travel along the caravan route. And so if you come from Israel and you hang a right, you go to Yemen, which is called Yemen, which means right. And if you hang a left, you go to northern Syria. And in Canaanite inscriptions and Phoenician inscriptions, they mention a land called Shamal or Smol, we don't know how it was pronounced, right? Which is in today northern Syria, southeastern Turkey, right? So that actually fits. And then if you think about it, if you're coming by boat up the Red Sea, what's on your right? Yemen. And what's on your left? Somalia, which is from the word small. Right, so it depended where your trade route was oriented. If it was oriented on the Silk Road coming from Israel, there's Yemen and Shamal, and if you're coming by boat, there's Yemen and Somalia. Right, Somalia is on your left, which, by the way, says something interesting. Why isn't Yemen on the left? Because whoever named it that was coming from the Indian Ocean or the Arabian Sea, whatever that thing's called down there. Right,
with Yemen. So Yemen is in Arabic, right? So the people that named the southern part of the peninsula, the Arabs, the people of Yemen, of the southern, didn't speak Arabic. So this is an Arabic word for the people who live in the south. So they're still facing to the east and talking about the people on their right that are the Yemenis, the southern people.
Yeah, but how does that explain Somalia?
I actually don't know the etymology of Somalia. It might not be related at all.
Someone can check and maybe there's other explanations and post it in the comments. So all right, so it's really interesting. So you have the directions, which are front and back and right and left, and
there's another system that we didn't discuss.
What's the other system? Yeah, talk about that.
There's important geographic signposts, important features of geography. So we said that in modern Hebrew and also in biblical Hebrew, there's Tzafon, that's the north. Now, Tzafon, that comes from a name of a particular mountain. How Tzafon, this is a mountain currently in sort of the border on the Mediterranean, close to the border between Turkey and Syria. So very north from Israel. But this was like a Mount Olympus of the Canaanite gods.
So explain what you mean by it was Mount Olympus. That's interesting.
So the abode of the gods. For many years, there was deep into late antiquity even. There was an important temple there. This was an important site. It's where the gods lived. If you climb up, you might meet Baal and I don't know, maybe El. Baal, he's the rain god, and the temples that were there were dedicated to him. So he was a very important god. When you live in a place where it doesn't rain all summer, and your livelihood, your subsistence is dependent on rain, the rain god is king, and Baal was a very important god in the region for many years. I doubt anyone worships him now, but he had his 50 minutes of fame.
Or maybe they don't call him Baal anymore, but that's a different subject.
There's in some respects that this is widely believed that a lot of the aspects of the Jewish God are are taken from Baal. In other words, Baal may have a lot of our God has a lot of Baal in him. And then the poetic verses that we find in the Bible, Psalms, etc., there's a lot of poems that we can see are very similar to poems to Baal in the ancient city of Ugarit, which was an ancient peoples that lived in what is now Lebanon. So there is something to that we may not call them.
Safon is north, where El Elyon had his palace, and his son maybe came to visit him. And then what's south in that system?
So that's the tricky one. So for south in modern Hebrew and also a lot in the Bible is darom. Now darom, we just don't know what that word means. It might be a site somewhere in the south, and it's just lost to us because we don't know of a site called Darom. There is a root that might have to do with being high up, and then, in other words, it could be related to Rome. This is a little difficult to explain, but it could be explained, and then it could be from the system of the movement of the sun. Because remember, we talked about the sun coming up, the sun going down, the sun being high would be appropriate for the south, because when the sun goes through the south, it goes in the high part of the sky.
That's in the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, I guess it goes the other way, right?
I doubt the ancient Hebrews knew that.
No, I know. I'm just saying for the flat earthers there, so who are listening. Okay.
Hi, guys.
All right, so we have darom is the modern Hebrew word. So you have tzafon, and what was the opposite of tzafon in that alternative?
So that's darom, which may have been or not.
What's another word for south that we have in the Tanakh? We have Negba, right?
That's right. There we go. Negba, which refers to the desert in the south, the dry part.
So if I said to an Israeli today, Ani nosea Negba, would they have I'm traveling towards the Negev, would they understand what I'm saying?
They would understand. They wouldn't take it as they would take it as you were going south. They wouldn't take it as, oh, he's using a word for south. But if you're saying you're going to the Negev, unless you happen to be in Eilat,
and then they wouldn't understand. If I was traveling from Eilat to Sharm el Sheikh, they wouldn't understand. Yeah. They think I'm going north, right?
Yeah. But and 99% of your conversations in Israel, if you say you're going Negba, people understand it. You're going to the desert, which is in the south, and that would make sense. There was also rarely the word yam, which means sea, does refer to south sometimes, which means it's referring to the Red Sea. But most of the time when the word yam is used for direction, it actually refers to the Mediterranean. So it's referring to the west.
Yeah.
Now, how they could have the same word refer to south and west simultaneously, I do not know and don't understand. But we have verses.
It could be confusing.
Yeah, try to give somebody directions.
Well, and then in the Tanakh you have like Ever HaYarden, which usually means east of the Jordan. But I think there's one verse somewhere where it refers to west of the Jordan.
Well, it depends. Ever HaYarden, the other side of the Jordan, right? So if you're
Transjordan, right?
Transjordan. If you're in Jordan, what we call Jordan today, Ever HaYarden would be Israel or Palestine. And if you are in Israel, Palestine, and you're using Ever HaYarden, then you're referring to Jordan.
Yeah. So I want to go in a bunch of different directions here. I'm not sure which one first. So I don't know if you have a study on this or you wrote about it, but you mentioned Baal. One of the things that was the most surprising thing to me that I encountered in modern Hebrew was when I was on a kibbutz when I was 17, and I was working in the Gadash, Gidulei Sadeh, in the agriculture, and they used the phrase Gidulei Baal. And I was utterly shocked.
Yeah. What's this foreign god doing in modern Hebrew?
So Baal crops. How did that come into modern Hebrew? Did that come from Yiddish? The real, I don't know the answer.
As far as I know, it didn't come from Yiddish.
Okay. Didn't expect it to.
So maybe we should explain what a Gidule Baal is.
Yeah. So it's, or go ahead.
Asde Baal is a field that isn't irrigated. You don't need to irrigate it. It gets its water from the rain.
The sky, which the ancient Canaanites believe came from Baal.
So yeah, so the rain god. So the Baal is a field that is watered by Baal, the god of rain. Right, we don't artificially water it. I'm actually not sure specifically.
That could be our next column. You can investigate that because I don't know where it came from. I find it hard to believe it didn't come from someone in modern Israel who said, "Oh, Baal is the god of rain. We need a term for non-irrigated crops. We'll call them the crops of Baal or the fields of Baal." I have no idea. It's hard to believe that's not the case.
And again, looking at it, I would say that there's probably something. There's probably a precedent in rabbinic literature somewhere.
Might be, yeah. If that's the case, that's even more fascinating because that means there's someone who in rabbinical literature who remembered that Baal was the god of the rain, which I don't know is obvious from medieval and ancient sources.
Maybe, but it might have been used not as a technical term and not having to do with the same way we do today.
So if somebody knows the answer, post it in the comments. And if not, you'll read about it in Elon's article in a couple of weeks, hopefully. I don't know. Maybe you'll find out because I don't know.
We have quite a bit of like foreign gods and demons in the Hebrew language.
So give me a few examples of that because that's always fascinating.
So for nightmare, we say Chalom Balaot or Siyut. Both of these, Siyut is like a demon from the Talmud, and Balaot are demons from the Bible. Chalom Balaot. Balaot, they're some kind of demons.
You said it was very rare to have a word that was Germanic of origin in Yiddish that came over into Hebrew. And I don't know of any examples off the top of my head, but I wouldn't. Do you know of any examples?
Well, there are, like in slangy words that make it through. This is actually not Germanic, but it is Yiddish. We call cockroaches. There's many words for cockroaches, but one of them is juk. This would be the most common.
Okay.
Now, in Yiddish, a juk is a beetle.
Okay.
Now, this is actually a Slavic word that's common to a lot of Yiddish words are also Slavic. So this comes from Russian and Polish, or Ukrainian. So that word did make its way in, but it made its way wrong. In other words, instead of referring to beetles, it's referring to cockroaches.
Okay, that's a good example.
People tried to make that word stomp it out, but like cockroaches, it was...
you can't get rid of it. What's the Hebraic word for cockroach then that they tried to replace it with?
So there's a few. There's also makak, which is like, there's makak sfarim in the rabbinic literature. It's probably a bookworm, but it was used. But the real official scientific is tikan. And that comes from the word tik, which is like a bag or a backpack, actually a Greek word. But Greek words that are used in rabbinic literature, if they're used like in the rabbinic literature, they get a pass in Hebrew. Like, if the rabbis use this Greek word, it's fine. And there's many of those. So ancient loan words are okay. Modern loan words aren't okay.
Well, I mean, they still end up in the language, right? Like most people say fontim and not gufanim for fonts.
So this revolutionary fervor that took place from the 20s to the 40s, and this process of everyone needs to speak Hebrew and Hebrew needs to be pure, and we need to purify the Yiddish and make the Hebrew really convincingly Hebrew. Once the state of Israel was founded, and that amazing generation that founded the state, gave way to the next generation. That generation already, and the current generations are just not interested in this at all. They stopped coming up with words. They just borrow words. It's not. It was only important to the people in the process of nation building, of we're doing this. Once it was done, the children that grew up speaking Hebrew as their native language, they didn't need to prove anything. They're
Mm.
already speaking Hebrew. This is
Wow.
it's a language. You don't need to do
So
anything.
in some ways, you're saying like that first generation that was trying to stamp out Yiddish, they literally like outlawed Yiddish theater and like famously and there were like patrols that if they heard people speaking Yiddish at a cafe, they would harass them, right? I mean,
Mhm.
so you're saying they kind of had a chip on their shoulder, that generation, and maybe they felt threatened, like I don't know if this is going to work, so we kind of have to be very intense about it.
Yeah, we know that this actually worked. They didn't know it's going to work.
Okay, right.
There's a
Wow.
famous story about Bialik, like a true story. Yeah,
Tell us who
Bialik,
Bialik is. You don't mean Mayim Bialik.
Nabaim Bialik. Also, another comparably great Jewish
And they're
person.
relatives, by the way. She's
Are they?
related. Yeah,
Oh, wow.
distant
Okay.
relative somehow. I don't know exactly, but yeah, same family. All right. So
So,
Chaim Nachman Bialik.
I'm
Yeah.
Nachman Bialik. So he's
Yeah.
a national poet. He was from Eastern Europe, a famous poet. Wrote in Hebrew. He also wrote stories and coined many, 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 many words. Probably the second most words per person after Ben Yehuda. And the most famous person, once he moved to Tel Aviv, the city of Tel Aviv built a grand house for him to like get him to come to live in Tel Aviv.
Really?
They built a street named after him, Bialik.
Even while he was alive, it was called that?
Well, yeah.
Oh,
And
wow.
at the end of that street, named after him, they built a grand house for him, and that's where he moved into that house. There's actually two streets in Tel Aviv named after him. There's Bialik Street and Shderot Chen Boulevard. With Chen is an acronym of Chaim Nachman.
Okay. Wow.
So he was a very, very famous man and like a superstar of his time, also a womanizer, but that's another story. We're talking about
so give me a time period of Bialik, because I'm really bad at that.
We're talking here when he's already living in Tel Aviv during the 30s, late 20s.
So he got out in time. All right.
Yeah. And he's walking down the boulevard, Rothschild Boulevard, and it's beautiful. And these flowering jacarandas around. And he's talking with his friend Ravinsky, who was a close friend and a publisher. And they're speaking with one another. They're the language that they spoke always, Yiddish.
Okay.
And then some like young kid comes up, and he's a member of this Tudei Hasafa Ivrit, so like the battalion
language patrols, or basically, or
whatever. So these are the people who are busting up theater productions in Yiddish, and he screams at Bialik, he's Mr. Hebrew language, like one of the like leading figures in the Academy of what was before the Committee of the Hebrew Language. And he screams at him, Bialik dober Ivrit. And Bialik...
Oh, so he knew who he was.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Bialik screams at him, Lech Lazazel, which is roughly equivalent to go to hell.
But it's literally go to Azazel, which is the place where they sent in Leviticus 16 the what's called in English the scapegoat incorrectly. But yeah, okay, go on.
Exactly. So this kid actually sues Bialik in the courthouse, the Hebrew courthouse in Tel Aviv. So he takes him to court for like insulting him or something like that. And there actually is a trial. And Bialik gets out of it because he says that it's actually not an insult, because Azazel is a beautiful place in Jerusalem where they used to throw the scapegoat in ancient times. This is one of the interpretations of Azazel. Azazel is really a demon god. Azazel. We have we learn about, he appears as Azazel in Leviticus, but when we read in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we learn about a angel, Azazel, who's the one who taught people the women how to make jewelry, the men how to make weapons. He's some kind of like evil demon kind of thing. And apparently, but according to Bialik, Azazel refers to the place where the Ishaiti, this is during the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, there would be two goats. One of them would be sacrificed to God, and the other one would be walked out to the desert and thrown to its death by a appointed man as a part of the custom. So when Bialik said, and this is one of the interpretations of what Azazel is, that Azazel is referring to the particular location where this is. And it's not like, he didn't say go to hell. He said, go to Azazel.
Leave Tel Aviv, get on road number 1 and go to Azazel east of Jerusalem. That was his a lovely defense.
Place. And I only meant that he should enjoy his trip there. And obviously nobody would find Bialik guilty. And this kid had to pay the court costs. And
that's a great story. So, all right, we talked about Yiddish. So, and I don't know if you have anything on this. If you don't, we'll just cut this out. But Ladino words, are there any Ladino words that you know about in modern Hebrew? Because that's the other common language, right?
Do you want to say something about Ladino?
Please, you say it about Ladino.
So Ladino is what is usually, we use the word Ladino to refer to Judeo-Spanish. We said before, if you remember an hour ago, we said that
in the previous episode.
We said that in each area where Jews were living, they spoke a variety of the local language that was like the Jewish variety, somewhat different from the other language. The language of the Gentiles, but obviously very similar to that language, local language. So in Spain, there was a Judeo-Spanish. Likely there were several Judeo-Spanishes because Spain itself had different languages spoken in it, all descended from Latin, from Vulgar Latin. Now, in 1492, the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Also, the same people who sent Columbus on their way also sent the Jews of Spain on their way and said, essentially, either you convert to Christianity and join us in the party, or you can leave. Many converted, many left. And those people who left, they took their language with them and settled in all kinds of places. In Northern Africa, in Turkey, in the Balkans, and what's today Greece, and throughout like the Arab-speaking world. Now, these people were somewhat like better well off than they were cultured, and often looked down on their lowly neighbors and didn't always mix with them. And they preserved their language. And this language still exists to this day. Almost. There are some native speakers. It's likely that the language will die off as a spoken native language. Maybe it just did. I don't know. But we're at the end of that hundreds of years long story. Now, a big part of the community, say at the time of World War II broke out, there were major concentrations of people speaking this Ladino around the world. The city of Saloniki, which is one of the biggest cities in Greece, maybe it was the second biggest city in Greece. It's a major port in northern Greece.
And for the Christians, that's where Paul says letter to the Thessalonians. That's Saloniki, Thessalonica. So Thessalonica in ancient times.
So this is a major important city, and most of the most spoken, the most common language in that city was Ladino. Like
more than Greek, you're saying?
More than Greek, yeah.
That I didn't know. Okay.
Most of the people there were Jewish, and they spoke Ladino. That was the community that lived there, and it was a giant community. And unfortunately, that community does not exist because similar to what happened to Ashkenazi Jews in Yiddish. Those people either were murdered in the Holocaust or made their way to Palestine and took on modern Hebrew. Now, we said before, there were a lot more Ashkenazim than there were Sephardim people. There's something interesting about the fact that we call people Sephardim. Those,
which means Spanish. Right?
Sfarad is Spain in Hebrew.
Right.
It really is a biblical word referring to somewhere that we don't know, but somewhere in the some point in the Middle Ages, Jews began referring to Spain as Sfarad. The same thing happened with Tzarfat in France, and that is the Hebrew word for Spain in France. So anyways, those people who migrated from Spain and to the Arab world, they became very important people in their communities. The communities adopted their way of doing things. In the synagogue, they founded their own synagogue. So when we say that somebody is Faradi, we're saying that they're like Spanish. But it's not that all these people were really descended from the people that were thrown out of Spain. It's that the community, the local communities, because these were the better folk. So the community, the local communities that already lived in those areas, they assimilated into the Sephardic community, the Spanish, communities of the descendants of the people who left from Spain.
Just so I understand, so there was a bunch of Jews, let's say, who left from Spain when they were expelled in 1492, and let's say, I don't know, they came to Tunis in North Africa, and they become the dominant force in Tunisian Judaism. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. There were Jews in Tunisia from antiquity and Roman times,
from Phoenician times, even maybe
possibly, but we definitely in Roman times there were Jews there, and likely there were Jews there throughout that time, all the way till I think there might be a few still today. But they consider themselves and they pray in the Sephardic tradition, and they might think of themselves as Sephardic, Sfaradim, because the people who settled during the expulsion from Spain and settled there, those were like the people you wanted to, the important people. They became the important people in the community, and they like exerted their influence in a way that because they settled in the cities. Once again, there's people living in the mountains, and like uneducated people. The people who came from Spain knew how to read and write. It was like that kind of imbalance. So, so this happened. We can now call all those people from the Arab world, except for the Yemenites, because well, I guess also Ethiopian Jews. So the Sephardic expats didn't make it all the way to Yemen, and Yemen was disconnected from the Jewish community of Yemen was disconnected from the rest of the Jewish world from the time of Maimonides until the modern period. So not them, but everyone else are considered Sephardic because those people mixed into that community, those communities, very different communities, far away communities.
So how did those words then end up in modern, or what are some examples of Sephardic words, meaning Ladino words, that end up into modern Hebrew?
So once again, there's very, very few. The influence of Ladino on Hebrew is small, because once again, the people who did found the language and the Jewish community in Palestine, which would become Israel, were mostly Ashkenazi Jews. So there's more Yiddish influence in Ladino. But you can find a little. One of those is a pile of money, like a wad of cash. In Hebrew is a stefa.
Stefa. Okay.
Stefa. This is a slangy term. That word comes from Ladino and originally from Greek, Turkish.
Oh, interesting.
So it doesn't come all the way from Spain, because for the hundreds of years that Ladino speakers lived in Saloniki and other areas of Greece, they also, and the Balkans, They adopted many Turkish and Greek words. If we want a word that goes all the way back to actual Spanish and to Latin, so you can say, this is a very slangy word, something that's really of poor quality, like it sucks. I don't know. You could say it's democulo.
Okay.
Which is comes from a archaic form of Spanish that was the meaning from the ass, like from the behind the rear end. So that's that came all the way from Spanish to Ladino to Hebrew.
Okay. Wow. I read somewhere that Ben Yehuda's wife coined the word Chanukiah, and she claimed that she had heard Ladino speakers use it, and that iya ending is really not common in modern Hebrew, not in that sense, right? And so that's interesting. There you have a word that obviously has a Hebrew origin, Chanukah, right? But then this particular formation of it supposedly comes from Ladino, which is, I don't know if that's true, but that's what she claimed.
Maybe.
And then they may have been using it for centuries in the Ladino world. So very interesting. So, all right. Wow, absolutely fast. Any final words that you want to share with the audience?
No, I very much enjoyed this, and I look forward to talking with you again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. Oh, say one last thing maybe about, I don't know, the Hebrew word lehitraot. Do you have anything you've ever written on that? Because that's a great word. Goodbye. I don't know.
Well, lehitraot literally means to meet again, I guess. To meet.
Be seeing you.
Be seen, yeah. But like, what do you call it? Like seeing each other. It's like
to see one another. It's a reciprocal action, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so it's to be, that really saying that we may see each other again.
So beautiful. Have you ever written about that in your weekly?
I actually haven't. No, I haven't.
I'd love to read that if you.
Maybe greetings could be something I could.
Yeah. All right, wonderful. Thank you for being
maybe the hardest part of my work at this point is finding words to write about because I've written.
We brought up two in this conversation: the hitraot, and I forgot what the other one was, but.
Baal.
Gidulei Baal. Oh, that's a really interesting one. And Stot Baal. Yeah, interesting. Awesome, wonderful.
Well,
thank you so
much. I'll look into those. I hope
wonderful.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.